This is a presentation on the founding of the 13 colonies, especially the ones that we have not already dealt with. We've already looked in detail at Virginia, at Massachusetts, at South Carolina. We're going to take a look at some of the other ones now. Um, if we can divide the colonies by region, it would fall out something like this. So the Chesapeake is simply Virginia and Maryland, the colonies around Chesapeake Bay, and we've looked at both of those. The New England colonies would include Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Um, Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams based on religious liberty and a better treatment of Native Americans. The middle colonies include New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. In the lower south, the two Carolinas and Georgia. Um, Rhode Island, as I was saying, was founded by Roger Williams after he was expelled from Massachusetts Bay. He believed in a more tolerant attitude toward other religious groups. Connecticut was founded partly on economic and political grounds. It was a fishing colony by Thomas Hooker, who was a Puritan in his theological beliefs. And New Hampshire was founded partly for political and economic reasons, also very similar in theology and religious beliefs to Massachusetts Bay. Now, New York is a whole other matter. Um, this was founded by the Dutch, and their whole empire was based on trade. And New York, then and now, had an excellent harbor, so it was an ideal port city. Uh, Now, I would argue that the original founding of New York as a port city based on trade continues to influence its character today as a city. It's very diverse, lots of people coming and going. Um, the English, however, conquered it very early in 1664, and when they conquered it, the Dutch put up no resistance. There were only about 9,000 people in New York when the English took it. Uh, it was formerly New Amsterdam, and it was given as a proprietary colony to the Duke of York. York is a city in England, so he called it New York. Um, the New York Times several years ago did some before and after pictures, and you'll see that in about 4 centuries, the transformation is overwhelming here. Times Square before and after. Um, and again, I mean, the transformation is unbelievable. You can make up your own mind about whether this is a change for the better or for the worse, but it clearly is a change that I think was in part inevitable. Uh, Again, okay. Now, New Jersey spun off from New York and was originally divided into East Jersey and West Jersey, but then this did not seem very viable, very practical. So the two Jerseys were united into the colony of New Jersey in 1702. Delaware was a spinoff from Pennsylvania. Originally, it was partly under the control of Pennsylvania, but then gained its independence in the early 18th century. And the last of the original 13 colonies to be founded was Georgia, founded in 1732 as a buffer between the lucrative rice fields of South Carolina and Spanish Florida. Of course, the Spanish were hostile to the English, and the English wanted some ground in between Spanish controlled territory and their wealthy colony of South Carolina. Georgia was conceived as a refuge for debtors, a place where prisoners could be sent. And of course, to fail to pay your debts was a crime, and they had things called debtors' prisons in those days. Um, it was also, in general, a place where poor people could come. The founders of Georgia saw it as a place where they could ban alcohol and slavery, but too many, as the settlers grew, more and more came. They were not willing to put up with either of those restrictions, so Georgia became a slave state, and of course, alcohol was permitted. Um, the coast of Georgia was very similar to the coast of South Carolina. It was a society based on rice. Now, I want to go into a little bit more detail about Pennsylvania. Um, it was originally settled by various groups, but the actual colony dates back to 1681, founded by William Penn. And like Maryland, this was a case where the king owed money to a wealthy family, in this case the Penn family, and he paid off that debt. He got out from under it by granting land to William Penn. Um, Now, at first, Pennsylvania was dominated by Quakers, um, and remained so for the better part of a century. Um, the Quakers were a very different kind of religious group. First of all, they paid a fair price to natives for land, and even if there were two groups of natives who made claims on the same land, sometimes they would pay a fair price to both of them. They were pacifists. They did not believe in violence. They did not believe in war, and they established religious liberty uh, for you know what was more commonly called at the time religious tolerance. They tolerated various religious groups. They did not believe in ministers. They believed in direct contact with God, uh, and their worship service was simply a meeting, unplanned, no leader, spontaneous. They would sit down in a room together, and whoever was moved by the Spirit would speak, and that became the nature of their worship services. They were also the first religious group to condemn slavery, and they actually disowned their own children. They cut them off from any inheritance if they strayed from Quakerism, and that included if they owned or bought or sold slaves. They were serious about that. So, going back to the 18th century, they were really the first abolitionists. Now, um, their dream was to protect their children and provide land for them. The Quakers were not very well off financially in England, not as well off as the Puritans were, for example. And they were worried that they didn't have enough land to divide it up among their male sons, so that those sons were starting to drift away from the unity of the Quaker community. They were losing their religious and cultural connections to their parents, and they wanted to be able to provide land to protect those values. They saw property as God's gift. And in Pennsylvania, if they could have several hundred acres of land, then they could have enough to set up their children with farms for one or two generations at least. Um, they accepted capitalism without ambivalence. This is in contrast to the Puritans, who saw material prosperity as a sign of election, but also were extremely aware of the hazards of materialism. Um, the Quakers, not so much. Now, a little bit on North Carolina. It was founded in 1663 and only later divided into North and South Carolina. South Carolina becoming a colony in 1670. Um, the land in the north was cheap. It was dominated by small farmers. And oddly enough, this was originally written, the constitutions of North Carolina were written as an attempt to recreate feudalism, which is a whole system that's way out of its time here. And that never really happened. Um, they believed in religious toleration. Uh, the population remained small. Uh, and the agriculture was mixed, no large commercial crop, partly because there were no good harbors. It was too hard to get crops to markets across the sea. Later, North Carolina became associated with tobacco. But in this period, Virginia is the colony and Maryland that are associated with tobacco, not so much North Carolina. Slavery at first was less important there because of the nature of the agriculture and the small population. But later on, as North Carolina grew, slavery became rooted